All right, we're going to talk about Chapter 7, Crime. So, criminal law versus criminal procedure. If you're guilty, it means the judge or jury found that a defendant has committed a crime. Criminal procedure is the process through which criminals are investigated, accused, tried, and sentenced. Criminal law, on the other hand, prohibits and punishes conduct outlawed by society. So, prosecution, only a government can prosecute a crime and punish with imprisonment. Private parties cannot do this. So, a business cannot prosecute someone in criminal court and punish them by imprisoning them. A burden of proof for criminal law is beyond a reasonable doubt. If there's any significant doubt, then the jury or judge must acquit the defendant. Right to a jury, if you're a criminal, the defendant has a right to a trial by jury if the charge could have a sentence longer than 6 months in length. A felony is a serious crime with greater than 1 year of prison, and a misdemeanor is a less serious crime with less than 1 year in jail. With restitution, it's a court order that the guilty defendant reimburse the victim of the crime for the harm suffered. And with a bench trial, if there's no jury, the judge renders a verdict. Criminal statutes must be clear. So criminal statutes must be clear and definite to enable ordinary people to understand them. And the enforcement cannot be arbitrary. With state of mind, we have voluntary act, entrapment, and conspiracy. With voluntary act, the defendant's not guilty if they're forced to commit the crime under duress, but they bear the burden of proving that they're under duress. With entrapment, if the government induces the defendant to violate the law, prosecution must prove that the defendant was predisposed to already commit the crime. And with conspiracy, it's illegal to conspire to commit crime, even if the crime never actually occurs. So now we move on to gathering evidence, which is covered by the Fourth Amendment. First, we have a warrant, which is written permission to conduct a search, usually issued by a judge. And they'll only issue this if there's probable cause. And probable cause is the likely that evidence of the crime will be found in the place that will be searched. So let's talk about searches without a warrant. In plain view, then a warrant is not required if the evidence is in plain view. Okay, so if you've got a bag of cocaine in your driver's seat, then it's in plain view when you get pulled over. Stop and frisk. Okay? Now, this may change with current events, but as of right now, the police have a right to stop and frisk, but only if they have a clear and specific reason to suspect that criminal activity may be afoot and the person may be armed and dangerous. Clearly, this is being abused. Emergencies. If the police believes that evidence is going to be destroyed, then they can search without a warrant. Automobiles are a special case. Okay? So if police have lawfully stopped a car and they see evidence of other crimes in the car, they can search. So, for example, cocaine or burglary tools. Incidentally, there are some exceptions, and so you can search the interior of the car, but if it has a trunk, unless you have evidence of a crime, you can't look in the trunk. Lawful arrest, they can always search someone that they've lawfully arrested. Consent, so if I live with someone else in a dwelling, that other person can authorize a search without my consent, and that's totally legal. So if you have a roommate, your roommate can authorize a search. No warrants required if there's no expectation of privacy. So let's say I'm staying in my friend's basement. I have no expectation of privacy. The police can come search it. And there are also some areas where it's being challenged in court even today, and so it's constantly evolving. So DNA tests, it's completely acceptable to obtain DNA when you arrest someone because it's not considered more intrusive than fingerprinting. Blood versus breath tests. So blood tests, you must have a warrant, but breath tests, you do not need a warrant. Heat-seeking devices, such as looking for growing lamps for marijuana, you do need a warrant. But some states won't even permit you to use them with a warrant. Digital cameras. So if a digital camera is in possession of someone who's arrested, the police can look at the pictures. With a cell phone, they need a warrant to listen in on your conversation or search the contents of the phone, but they don't need a warrant to see records from the phone company. With a computer, you need to have permission in order to search the data on the computer. It's still to be determined by court case whether cloud-based data is considered requiring a warrant. GPS tracking devices, you need a warrant. Email is a very complicated case. With email, you don't need a warrant to find out address information such as who you emailed. But you do need a warrant to intercept email that's in transit. But you don't need a warrant if you're searching already opened email or messages that were sent at least 6 months prior. Now, there's this thing called the exclusionary rule. And what it means is if the evidence was gathered illegally, you cannot use it at trial. It's considered fruit of a poisonous tree and it's inadmissible. So example, I point a heat sensor, I'm the police, I point a heat sensor at a house, I don't have a warrant, I accidentally point it at the neighbor's house and I discover they're growing weed. Inadmissible. But there are always exceptions to these rules. One is inevitable discovery. If it would have been discovered even without the police's illegal behavior, then it could be admissible. If it's an independent source and it came from a second source, for example, then it would be admissible. And then good faith exception. If the police believe that a warrant was valid and it later was not, then the evidence would be acceptable. After arrest, this is where the Fifth Amendment applies. First of all, due process. So we have to have fairness at all stages of the case. Secondly, self-incrimination. This is where people plead the fifth or take the fifth. This bars the government from forcing you to provide evidence against yourself. Next is the Miranda rights. You have the right to an attorney. You have the right to remain silent. This wasn't always the case. This is only about 50 years old, this ruling. Okay? This is something that's required to be given to you at arrest time, and the case is in the slide there. Continuing on with post-arrest, you have a right to a lawyer. This is a Sixth Amendment guarantee for all important stages of the criminal process, and the government must provide one if you do not have the ability to afford one. Indictments and grand juries. Grand juries are a group of citizens who decide whether there's probable cause to pursue prosecution for a criminal act, and the indictment is a formal charge against the defendant. Arraignment is the reading of the formal charges and entering of a plea, and a plea bargain is an agreement between the prosecution and defendant. Discovery is where we hand over evidence to the defendant, and a trial and appeal. If you have no plea bargain, you go to trial. It's similar to the civil process. Double jeopardy says we can only prosecute someone once for a crime. And then punishment, Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, but the death penalty isn't considered cruel and unusual by the Supreme Court. So now let's talk about business crimes. Larceny, this is trespassing, taking of a personal property with the intent to steal it. Embezzlement, this is fraudulent conversion of property already in your possession. Fraud, this is deception of another person for purpose of obtaining money or property from them. Wire fraud is a form and mail fraud are forms that occur a lot of times. Insurance fraud, internet fraud, these are all different categories of fraud. Arson is the malicious use of fire or explosives to destroy or damage real or personal property. Hacking is when we gain unauthorized access to a computer system. Some crimes that businesses can commit: making false statements. It's illegal to make false statements or engage in a cover-up during any dealings with the U.S. government. There can also be workplace crimes. Things like RICO and money laundering. There's also hiring illegal workers. There's a verification process that you have to follow as the business, and if you don't follow that, you could go to jail. And then there's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to help prevent bribes and ensure that companies have record keeping. And then there's also obviously other crimes. In terms of punishments, there can be fines. This is most common. And businesses are expected to have compliance programs. And then there are federal sentencing guidelines, that are rules that the judges must follow when they're dealing with defendants that are convicted of crimes in federal court.